So I'd like to wax a little bit more into the terror, the cosmic terror, primordial terror aspect, because we've laid out the science, and the science is fancy, and it's an interlocutional science, a multidisciplinary and multidimensional science that compresses down into a kind of single glowing ball of light, so to speak, across all scalar dimensions. And we can talk about those characters, but right, this is the issue with intellectualizing and academicizing, right? This experience, which again, if we understand it correctly and explicitly via quantum mechanics, that it's a participatory universe, an experiential universe of consciousness exchange, awareness, and the impact that consciousness has on space and time as a constructive force and factor. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about unconscious nature as a systems process which is running automatically, as a increasingly intelligent, deterministic waveform model that's being replicated across scales through linguistic modifiers, as we discussed with genetics or stellar forges, right? The stellar forge elementally is a linguistic modifier which is producing language, as in the element. The human body is in the chemical or the hormone or the synaptic register. And we draw that down into the experience itself, which is of the essence. And again, this is the unity of existentialist philosophy with quantum mechanics and theoretical physics, which is of the essence. That which is of the essence is the experience of being human as it is formally quantified and made into a qualifier. As in the experience itself, quantified down through the genetic and linguistic chain of information, made into sophisticated waveform, right? Multidimensional waveform, which is, you could describe that as the vortex of the heart, or the delicate architectural symmetry of the lungs or the nervous system. And to step into that somnambulistic unconscious architecture of nature, and through that somnambulistic unconscious architecture of nature to wake up into the quantum mechanical realization of the psyche as the orchestrative force of the cosmos, as elucidated in the Heraclitean axiom, the aeon is a child at play with colored balls. The aeon is the child itself, and the child is the character at play, the being at play with colored balls, which are themselves the physical, the interdimensional, scalar, cross-scalar, right, cross-functional, physical. It is a creational process that is a being at play, which is a recombination. So this is a progressive awakening, right? Because this is an awakening out from under the primordial construction of the colored ball, which is to say the neuron, the nucleotide, the atom, the molecular, the particulate, all of which themselves are the formal constructions which radiate themselves into the presence of being as in a temporary waveform with a characteristic density, which is itself that which constitutes temporal presence. And so the human being itself is having the quantum experience of the waveform down through itself, which is the awakening of consciousness unto itself through the device which unconscious nature presents, impregnates itself with, and realizes itself through. And this is the essential liberation work of the human being and of consciousness itself as an eternal process and procedure of translation down into forms. And this is equivalent of a waveform loss. Concept of sonic losslessness here is deeply applicable because what happens when you translate essential information such as metaphysical character, as in character of the quantum mechanical universe, as in the being itself, down through scales, is that there's loss. Just the same as a linguistic translation would occur between cultures, we're talking about a linguistic translation that's occurring through scalar modifiers, as in degrees, as in cosmos, as in spheres, as in concentric circles, in the Kabbalic sense of colored balls. Again, right, this is astrophysical all the way down to the atomic. So when that speech of being, as in the waveform, and again, this is the logos, we're discussing the logos here, is translated down through scales, there's a loss. And that loss is articulated in the presence of the being, in the awareness and the awakening of itself unto itself. And this is by nature the unconscious nature, as in a forgetting, as in a teleology, as in a symbolic chain, a chain of representative being, which is projected out through pictorial imagistic dimensions, which are themselves degrees of forgetting, as in proximal distance. And this is paradoxically, or perhaps ironically, what allows for and enables life on Earth, which is, again, symbolic distance between the Earth and the Sun, as in the star system that sustains it in terms of the thermonuclear radiation, which moves through it, and as such produces all of its outcomes and its nutriments, which it progressively consumes down through what is called on Earth proverbial food chain, as in an energetic train and chain of translation and transformation, all of which itself is the same across scales. And so this experience itself is the experience of the horror of the revelation of forgetting, which is to say the awakening into the bestial night, so to speak. And this, of course, is a genealogy and a genetic chain which extends thousands and millions of years into a primordial history which is impenetrable to the conscious mind and only accessible directly through the body as a private ontology. This itself being a linguistic script which extends effectively into the infinity, which is the ungraspable of the human nature, and as is such the primordial terror and the primordial night which haunts it and possesses it and dictates it unto the awakening of consciousness itself as the force, or the origin force, that itself being the will, primordially and primarily in a natural cosmological being sense, out from under this night of history, so to speak. And so this is the experience of the organism terror, because it's locked into this temporal night, which is to say the experience of the entropic thermodynamic body, which is a translation of the thermonuclear energetic principle of the stellar nuclear system within which it resides. And then foremost, again, a translation of the essential creative nature of being itself as articulated in the Heraclitean axiom. The aeon is a child at play with colored balls. So to understand this is a forgetting of the essential character and essence and identity of being itself, and an awakening into a form which is constricted, into a terror of limits and limitations, which is necessarily the essence of language. So when Wittgenstein speaks of the language problem, it's much deeper and much further and beyond what modern philosophy or psychology or even semiotics would suppose, is that the language problem is itself the scalar construction of the universe, and as such, the losslessness, as in being in translation down through it, which is the failure to retain or obtain the primordial object itself, which is the absolute psychic wholeness of the universal. And as is such, the psychic liberation of being itself unto its revelation, refracted and reflected down through scales, directly in the perceptive aperture of the human being, or the scalar being, or the microcosmic node of being, which returns itself to full apprehension of the essential metaphysical primordial character of being itself. And we've discussed this before as in a reunion or a primordial unity, And this is the awakening of the animal being into the night of history, which is itself possessed of these temporal nodes and nodules, or technologies or prostheses, which itself is the awakening of natural primordial consciousness into arms, legs, and the embodied apperception and interrelationship with the physical forces which not only construct it but dictate it in a space-time sense, which is an astrophysical relative sense, which is a Newtonian sense. So it's bound in these false chains, or it appears to be. Right, because this is a linguistic construction of the universal, which is necessarily time-space bound, as in a formal language. When we're talking about linguistics, we are talking about the letter, the word, the speech waveform, that itself being the break or the code or the lock to the sigil of the dynamic of the perceptual conflict between the phenomenological Newtonian and the primordial cosmological quantum mechanical. This is the breach in the bridge through which consciousness flows and is awakened through the node, as in the aeon as a child playing at colored balls in a eternal darkness unto the spark of light, which is the replication of a radiant awareness. And by radiant awareness, I mean the firing of the synaptic engine. And this is all in eternal resonance. This is what's so important to be understood, right? Is that this is an eternal resonance which is super temporal, but which is pastiched and transposed upon the appearance of the temporal realm as a series of brief figurations in this essential metaphysical primordial language, which is itself the speech, and it is to be forgotten as in the language itself, which is the linguistic modifier, which is translated down through scales. Again, in a scalar sense, meaning necessarily loss, as in losslessness. This is, so to speak, the corruption of the audio file, in and through which the essential nature is through densities, through translations and transmutations and transformations of the waveform, as in an ongoing complexification of space-time dynamics. Again, in a scalar sense, being within being within being. As in a translation of this nuclear, we'll say thermonuclear radiation. It's a form of existential fission, which is, again, replicated in the process of cell division, which is, again, replicated in the process of strings of language. And when we're talking about weaving strings of language, we're talking about a primordial cosmic quilt of being, which perhaps is most necessarily replicated at the microcosmic level in the genetic structure of the organism itself. And this is a long-term, this is a deep time procedure of speech, which becomes the linguistic strands which constitute the formal construct, which is neurologically sophisticated and sophisticating, as in the development of the synaptic device of perception itself, as in the hindbrain and the forebrain. And this is the revelation to various different degrees of awakening unto the terror, which is the forgetting, which is the lost code. Again, the lost code as in the losslessness of the audio file. This is elucidated quite clearly in the principle of the Om in the ancient Hindu. This is a sound. It's an elucidation, which is itself a body, a waveform body of temporality, which is the eternal. But where is the source of that one who speaks? As Newton says, who is the one that performs gravity? We cease to describe the phenomenon and ask ourselves, what is the character of that which is? And this, again, is the fundamental principle of the Vedanta. So this is the beginning of the inquiry, which is the existential condition of the human being, and the human being is always already that inquiry. It is necessarily replicating its status as in the dimension of its interrogation of that which it is itself, as in its awareness. In the prism of that which it experiences and the depth to which that it has penetrated into this breach, which is itself a temporarily horrifying truth between the nature of being itself and the status of the ground of the temporal, which is the temporary figuration of the being in that which it experiences formally as a construct. And this is paradigmatic in the sense of a species as an epoch. So that's what I got. I'll catch you on the next one.